Hello everyone and welcome to today's webinar. On behalf of American Petroleum Professionals of Iranian Heritage, APPIH, we welcome all of you. From last year, we started a series of talks that overview careers of seniors in oil and gas and their perspective and advice for next generations. Today, we have a great honor to host Dr. Mohammadi to overview his career and listen to his advice. Dr. Shane Mohammadi is an Iranian immigrant currently serving as a CEO of PetroInternational, which provides consulting and training services in oil and gas industry. Shane completed his education at Colorado School of Mines, MIT, and University of North Carolina. He holds a PhD in chemical engineering and a number of publication patents on enhanced oil recovery, heat transfer, and LPG transportation. He is married and has 2 children and lives in Southern California. I would thank Dr. Mohammadi for accepting our invitation, and without further delay, I'm transferring microphone to him for starting his presentation. Thank you.
To begin with, I'd like to thank APPIH and Dr. Samawi for inviting me to share my experience with colleagues, and in particular, younger generation in our industry. Before I start, I wanted to acknowledge my father, who he dedicated his career to NIOC and was responsible for my first visit to an oil well at age 7. I remember he was picking me up from school, and he got a call on his radio to go to a well site and directed his car, and we arrived at this area that I had no idea, being 7 years old. I just saw a large piece of equipment and a number of people who were working on that. Later on, I found out that it was an Otis valve, a Christmas tree rated about 10,000 PSI, which are used in Iranian fields for productions of wells with 20,000 plus barrels of oil per day. My goal in this presentation is show that our industry offers many diverse career options, and it's up to us to align our goals and create our career roadmaps. As an overview, I started my education in the 70s, as mentioned earlier, Colorado Mines, MIT, and UNC Ken Flagler Business School. After graduation, I started working at Unocal in California. My focus was in enhanced oil recovery, reservoir engineering, and then later on international business development. The areas that I was covering was USA, Southeast Asia, and Middle East. After some 20 years with Unocal, I joined ExxonMobil in early 2000, and my responsibilities were in development planning, engineering, and project management. The areas that I served were USA, Middle East, Russia, Europe, Central Asia, and West Africa. And then shortly after retiring from ExxonMobil, I started a company, PetroInternational, with the aim of focusing on project planning, execution, and management, along with some training and consulting. Let me start with the 1980s, working at Unocal, which is now Chevron, EOR technology development. The history of these EOR technology at the time was that oil prices rose dramatically post-Iranian Revolution. U.S. government introduced a windfall profit tax along with incentives for investments in EOR. If you all have paid attention to the current news, even today there are talks of windfall profit tax, but there's no talks of what they're going to do with the windfall profit tax. Hopefully, maybe they will reignite some investments in domestic production through EOR or some other techniques. This policy, windfall profit tax, results in a significant expansion of EOR applications. My role at the time was technology scale up through field application of chemical and thermal EOR technologies. I'll be talking about two examples that I was principally involved in and had a key role. One was my solar polymer flooding pilots in California. My solar polymer flooding uses a surfactant for releasing residual oil to form an oil bank. The oil bank is then mobilized by a polymer solution that acts as a mobility control, and which drives the oil bank toward the producer, and the residual oil is then produced. In a particular case that we applied this technology, a field known as Colingo Nose Unit, the field was located halfway between Los Angeles and San Francisco. And it was an 8,000-foot deep wells or reservoir, typical gravity of 28 to 32 API. And we started to propose the project to our partners, which were several different companies, and were able to convince them to run a project budgeted at $50 million. The money received was used initially to drill some additional wells to generate our patterns for the test. And shortly after completion of the wells, we began to inject a brine solution as a pre-flush to prepare the reservoir and reduce the absorption for our polymer as well as the surfactant. After the completion of the brine flush, we began the injection of polymer to create a uniform mobility front, but unfortunately we had issues with injectivity, or we could not inject the polymer. We made several attempts over a period of over a year and a half, and were unable to establish a sizable quantities of polymer. We did manage to inject a little bit of surfactant, but overall the project was a technical failure, unfortunately. Although it was a technical failure, it became a financial success. And the reason was because we had deposited the $50 million into a bank account, saving account, which was collecting 18% return. And the amount of interest that we collected far exceeded how much we ended up spending over a 3-year pilot project. So we were able to return the original money plus a little bit of interest back to the owners. That was an experience out of this flood. Other project that I was involved with were steam foam flooding pilots in California and Wyoming. The technology is an enhancement over a steam drive. In a typical steam drive, steam tends to override the producing horizon. Some of the oil that is exposed to steam, viscosity drops and is produced. But in a mature steam flood, after the continuous injection, there is what we consider to be a thief zone, which tends to override, push the steam above and then into the producer. In order to resolve this issue, there were some laboratory experimentation that were conducted by Unical and other companies. And the conclusion was that by addition of a surfactant, typically is C1618 alpha olefin sodium sulfonate, and a non-condensable gas such as nitrogen, we could generate a foam inside the reservoir. A series of studies were conducted at the laboratory, and then once they were optimized, we took this project to the field, and this particular application was in Midway Sunset Field. We took 4 inverted 5-spot patterns and were able to inject over a period of almost 3 years. We were injecting continuously foaming agent with nitrogen along with steam. This project was successful, and some publications were made we're looking approximately 5 to 7% incremental oil for the surfactants to be injected, and the overall project based on the price of oil at the time was economically successful. However, later on, as the price of oil started dropping, these particular applications, they lost their economic advantage because the price of oil was too low to justify addition of chemicals as well as operating costs. Now, let me switch to some work that I did on business development in the Middle East. To set history, Unocal sold all of its downstream and California upstream assets and began expanding its upstream globally under a new venture called Unocal International Energy Ventures. The sale of the properties that Unocal had that switched Unocal from an integrated oil company to an upstream oil company were approximately $1.2 billion. This money was then was allocated over a 3 to 5 year period to jumpstart these operations in various parts of the world. My role was to take Unocal to Middle East, form a legal entity, and engage in energy projects. When I arrived in the Middle East, I worked with the U.S. embassies in Kuwait and Qatar, Doha, and was able to establish a legal entity for Unocal in both countries. And that legal entity was then the base from which we were able to go after various opportunities in the region. One of the first areas that we participated in had to do with the evaluation of Iranian buyback contracts for the international oil companies. The buyback contracts were offered by Iran in the mid-90s, and they were a form of payback to foreign oil companies who were interested in investing in Iran. And the idea was that you could recoup your cost through a guaranteed rate of return over a period of time. We engaged the National Iranian Oil Company in some very high-level discussions in Tehran and had several meetings, but while we were proceeding or moving forward, trying to identify specific fields that we could participate in, U.S. government imposed sanctions on Iran, and we had to discontinue this activity and withdraw from Iran. Next example of projects that I want to share with you has to do with the reconstruction of a power generation plant in Kuwait. The picture on the right-hand side, I believe you can see the picture, shows a turbine from a gas-powered electrical generation plant that was that just before Iraqis left Kuwait, they planted dynamite under the main shaft and destroyed the turbine. When I was in Kuwait looking around for different projects, we identified this area and decided to put together a proposal for the Ministry of Electricity and Water in Kuwait. The proposal was that we would replace this power plant, which was rated at 600 megawatt, with a 900 megawatt power plant, and that the 600 megawatt would replace what they already had, and the 300 megawatt addition would then be a revenue for our investments in Kuwait and our operating and capex costs. We put the proposal together with the assistant with some engineering assistant from Fluor Daniel, and prepared the package that we engaged the Ministry of Electricity and Water in a series of discussions. Approximately a year later, as we continued with our discussions, we hit a dilemma, which was that we were not getting the guidance that we wanted toward moving ahead with the project. So by arranging a high-level meeting with His Excellency, the Minister of Electricity and Water, and presenting the project, they graciously told us that we can go ahead and do the upgrade. However, the government of Kuwait would not sign a take-or-pay agreement that we needed in support of our funding. And that we were encouraged to go ahead and build the plant. And when the plant was ready, we would then sell the electricity to Kuwait, and they would be able to, they would be happy to pay for it. Well, as much as this was a successful conversation, from a commercial standpoint, we could not move forward because without a guaranteed agreement, we couldn't convince corporate to invest the money needed to rebuild the plant. So we learned a lesson that when we get involved in projects like these, that we have to establish our contractual agreements very early on before going on for extended period of time and spending money to reach a point where we hear the disengagement news. Another project that I want to talk to you has to do with an engagement in an offshore Qatar production sharing agreement, specific field known as Al Shaheen field. At the time, I remember this is mid 90s or late 90s. Consortium of IOCs were operating this field with Maersk designated as the operator. And while we were there, we identified an opportunity for participating as a member of the consortium by investing something on the order of $150 million in the project. The problem that we had was the money was not available, and we had to come up with a way to convince Unocal to participate. Through conversations with my counterparts around the world, we realized that there was a possibility that we could deregister an early company known as Union Oil Company of Syria Limited that had done some operations in Syria, and then transferring that entity for a release of some tax liabilities, and then using those revenues to then, as a down payment with the corporation, and convince them to then move forward with the balance of the payment for us to participate in Al Shaheen. I had to make several trips to Syria, Damascus, to understand exactly why Union Oil of Syria had not deregistered its proceeded with the registration of its entity. And the history behind that was that Union Oil had made a commitment to 3 exploration wells in Syria in the 70s. And after completing 2 of the wells, they realized that there was no prospects whatsoever, and they did not want to spend the additional resources and money to drill the 3rd well. And had conversations with Syrians, but unfortunately these conversations did not resolve, and this case was put on hold. Neither side was talking about this. When I was in Kuwait, this was several years later. And so I made a trip to Damascus and had conversations with a legal representative in Syria, and did an evaluation assessment of the available issues. It turned out that there were some 400 lawsuits from employees of the Union Oil Syria, as well as some accidents, there's car accidents or auto accidents around the country that involved some of the Union Oil expats and other employees, as well as some guarantees in the custom, which had prevented custom from releasing the equipment that belonged to Union Oil. To make a long story short, it took approximately 6 months to go through all of these assessments and then negotiate a settlement, and we were able to settle all the lawsuits and release the entity, deregistered Union Oil Syria Limited, and settle all the lawsuits. By then, however, the opportunity for participation in Al Shaheen had passed. And so even though we were successful in raising the money through release of tax liabilities, we were unable to engage in the Al Shaheen field. In early 2000, I joined ExxonMobil, and one of the first projects that was assigned to me was Sakhalin-1 project. The history of the project was development of oil and gas from 3 offshore fields. A picture on the right-hand side shows the field. Sakhalin Island is located north of Japan, and there are basically 3 fields that are available for production. Extended reach drilling from onshore was in the plan to reach the wells from what we call on the right-hand side. Excuse me, one second. Mr. Hamid, is the view of the people blocking some of the slides or not?
No. Everything is
okay. All right. Because on my screen, on my screen is blocking the slide. That's fine.
Okay.
The Chivo field is the one that drilling is done from the island. A picture of the drilling facilities is shown on the lower. This particular drilling arrangement allows the drilling rig to drill in an angle, thus reaching further out in the ocean and hitting the target. On the lower part, the 2 other fields, we use the gravity-based platform, and this gravity-based platform used to be used Exxon was using that in Alaska, and when the field was Sakhalin was identified, the gravity base was mobilized from Alaska and transferred to the site, and was then landed and were used for drilling from offshore into the reservoir. A consortium led by ExxonMobil was awarded a production sharing agreement in 1996. However, the development plans for the field were to be put together and presented to Russians. Proven reserves of 17 billion barrels of oil equivalent. The project had targeted 250,000 barrels per day of production. The field currently holds a record for longest extended reach well in the world, at just over 15 kilometers. In fact, there are 4 other wells in this field that are at the top 7 or 10 length on extended reach wells around the world. My role was to review development plans with Russian Central Development Committee and secure approvals for Exxon to move forward with the project. Now, I'm going to ask you to visualize some 10,000 pages of documents covering technical, financial, legal, regulatory, environmental, in 2 languages, English and Russian. And visualize that we wanted to review all of these documents with the members of the Central Development Committee of Russian Federation and get their approval to move forward. It took about 2 years for us to do that. Typically, I spent most of the time in Moscow. Typically, would get up in the morning, take 2 translators, and then 1 expert for the particular subject that we wanted to discuss. And we would then visit our counterpart on the development committee, either being in one of the universities, Roglan Institute of Technology, or some of the government institutes. And we would put 2 pages on a table one in English and one in Russia, and we would go over these 2 pages word by word. Translators would translate, and then we would engage in a conversation to make sure that Russians accepted what we had proposed in our plans. This process went on for, as I mentioned, close to 2 years until we completed the reviews. And after the completion of the review, there were 9 directors, each responsible for an area of development plan, for example, regulatory or reservoir or production. And these 9 individuals had series of meetings with us that they approved our plans, and then after the approval, supported us to go ahead and present these to the, in a planetary session, to the extended membership. The extended membership was about 120 engineers and scientists, and a session approximately 2 days of reviews. We would display slides in English and in Russian side by side on the screen, and we'll go through those slide by slide. And after the completion of all the presentations, then we would have to have whole discussions with the extended members to get their approval. This process took another maybe a couple of months, after which we received approval and we were able to move forward with the development. Now, I think recently you might have heard that ExxonMobil had divested their interest in Sakhalin and pulled out because of the recent sanctions and the Russian invasion of Ukraine. I believe Exxon received $4 billion in their negotiations. I'm not sure if they've got the money yet, but that's what's going on today on this particular project. Again, in early 2000, one of my other assignment projects that I think was of interest and is of interest to probably this particular group was Kazakhstan energy resource planning. The history of this project was that in support of North Caspian development, a field known as Kashagan, that is in North Caspian side in Kazakhstan territorial waters, ExxonMobil sanctioned a study of Kazakhstan's upstream and downstream development options. A portion of the study covered the Central Asian gas network, some 19,000 kilometer pipelines connected gas from Turkmenistan, Uzbekistan, and Kazakhstan, and going through export route Russia to Europe. This is the particular collection of gases that are being routed along with some gas from the Russians to Europe that has been in the news in the last several months. My role was to develop a simulation model of gas network and use this model to evaluate expansion plans and gas transmission options. You can see on the right-hand side these gas pipelines. They're 52-inch pipelines and multiple gas compressor stations along the way. And as a part of the developing a simulation model, we had to acquire a history of production and transfer of gas excuse me, through this network, and then do a once we put the model together, do a history match of the last 10 years of transfer through the system. And once that was completed, then we used that to propose optimize alternative gas export route systems. For example, one taking gas to China, shown in blue. Now, keep in mind, this was done in the early 2000s, but this Chinese route is now in play, and the Kazakhs are actually transferring some of the gas to China, and they're looking at some alternatives based on some of the earlier studies that we conducted. In addition to completion of the study, we also had to train engineers from Gemini Gas to be able to run this model, and then as well as some general training on simulation models for pipelines and compressors and so on and so forth. In the mid-2000s, I was transferred to Doha, Qatar, working on some energy projects. The history of this project is that Qatar Petroleum had plans to reach 78 million tons per year of liquefied natural gas, along with 500,000 barrels per day of condensate. These plans were to be executed and have that capacity available in early 2010s. After the merger between Exxon and Mobil, ExxonMobil began a major expansion of its LNG projects in Qatar. They created two ventures. One was Qatar Gas and the other one was Ras Gas. And the intent of these ventures were to take gas from North Field, which is a part of South Pars Field, and then transfer that in form of LNG for markets around the world. Right-hand side, I'm showing you a map of Doha. Ras Laffan industrial area, which is the site of these facilities, is approximately 80 kilometers north of Doha. The site itself is massive, 295 square kilometers, and all of the facilities for transfer and separation of gas, separation, liquefaction, separation of condensate, LPG, butane, and then some other products like sulfur, for example, all are conducted in this particular area. The level of investment in this area was massive. At the time where I was in Doha, there were 80,000 laborers working every day on building these projects. And of course, some projects that we were involved in were stewarded by ExxonMobil. There are other projects stewarded by Total, Chevron, other companies, many different products. Gas, as I mentioned, gas separation. There were some electrical generation, massive electrical generation units there, water desalination, all of that in this particular area. My role was to prepare and lead ExxonMobil funding for the LNG trains and common facilities. The LNG trains, of course, there was a known. The common facilities were a set of facilities that would gather all of the production from various ventures. For example, all of the LNG produced by Total, by Exxon, by Chevron, by others, would be collected into a common LNG tank farm. And then we would use LNG berth to load the LNG into ships. All of the sulfur collected from various ventures, about 10,000 tons per day of sulfur, was also collected into a common facility, and then it was loaded into shipped through sulfur ships. Funding of these projects required that we had to pull together cost and schedule from all of our investments, pull them together, and then put together funding packages, which would then review at different levels of management within ExxonMobil, and then finally review those with the Treasury and get approval for investment into these projects. Investment levers for common facilities, for example, were about $4.5 billion. Some of the LNG plants were as much as $12.5 billion for an LNG, for several LNG trains that ExxonMobil was involved in. After I completed the funding reviews and approvals, I was assigned to the project member, as a member of a project management team on some of these projects during the execution phase. I was on site approximately 3.5 years where we were building some of the facilities. And just to give you a scale of operations, this particular slide shows you one of the LNG trains, I believe it's Gas 2. This train took about 3 years of construction. We had approximately 8,500 workers on site every day. Just visualize, just keeping track of how many people would arrive daily on the site in buses was a task, and that was just the beginning of the story. We had to have schedules specifically for all the activities that had to be executed on every day, all planned out for these workforce to conduct. And while we were doing this, we had to make sure that everybody was safe. The workforce here came from all over Asia because Qataris basically don't have any laborers. These people, workers were coming in from Philippines, from Thailand, from Pakistan, from North Africa, and language skills quite limited. We had to use significant amount of international signs and guides and what have you to make sure that everybody knew what we were doing and that, more importantly, keep them safe. The safety records for these plants were very, very impressive. Lost time incidents, for some of you who are familiar with, were very, very low. And fatalities were minimal. We probably had on this project, we may have had one fatality, which of course is unfortunate, but considering 3 years of 8,000 people a day working, these are very impressive figures. After the completion of these projects, then I was assigned as a technical support member post-startup. And the focus was on achieving nameplate capacity of these LNG trains. And this is something that most people don't recognize. When a plant is constructed and it starts operation, the capacity is not reached immediately. The plant may be operating at about 85 to 86% of its design capacity. So a lot of effort has to be made, some investigative efforts and some design modifications and so on and so forth in order to reach the nameplate capacity for the train. And if you consider a train that is processing 4 billion cubic feet of gas a day, going from 87% capacity to 90% or 99% capacity is a significant improvement in the productivity and economics of the project. In mid-2010, after returning from the Middle East, I was assigned to work on Mobil producing Nigeria. The history of the projects were that Mobil producing Nigeria is a subsidiary of ExxonMobil. It was acquired by Exxon after post-merger with Mobil. They have approximately 3,500 employees. These are local employees. And typically between 200 to 300 expats are part of the workforce in Nigeria. One of the key assets was an 800,000 barrels per day storage and loading facility in western Nigeria. This facility needed modernization after many, many years of operation. My role was a business manager responsible for project controls, schedule, contract administration, and procurement. And the team that we had in Nigeria was responsible for all phases of design and planning, design, funding, and then of course, construction and oversight. There are many, many challenges operating or doing construction in the area, some having to do with the weather, and some having to do with manpower and the infrastructure and all that. But we were able to construct or modernize the facilities, primarily replacing all the electrical systems in the entire plant, as well as some hydraulic and some equipment, and modernize some installation of some power stations and substations and so on and so forth. One of the other things that I was responsible for in concurrent with my assignment as a business manager was that I was a training coordinator and a lecturer. We had approximately 70 and 80 local engineers that needed to be trained. These were a lot of young engineers who had with 1 or 2 years in the industry. And we needed to train those on various aspects of project control and projects as a whole. And we developed a series of modules. We had a total of 15 modules put together. And then each week we would review one module with various groups of 10. And this went on for over a year, and we were able to complete our training of all the engineers over a 1-year period, and teach them about project management on the type of facilities that they had in the country. And concurrent with that, there was a surprise that showed up in 2013. If you may recall, there was an Ebola outbreak in West Africa. And Ebola, being such a dangerous disease, once was caught by someone, there was no recovery. The virus would essentially attack the red cells and dissolve the red cells, and the victim would start bleeding and bleeding to death, and that was very quick. We had a facility that housed over 350 expats and contractors in Victoria Island and right outside of Lagos. That facility, we had people coming in and out of the facility, flying in and out from outside the country, as well as going to sites and traveling between offices and between fields and various facilities. And we had to control the outbreak and make sure that no one in this facility was exposed to Ebola. And that was a role that was given to me, and I had a coordinator to work with our safety as well as our medical staff to make sure that we controlled the outbreak and prevented anyone from dying. And I have to say that we were successful in accomplishing that. Now I want to spend a few minutes on PetroInternational. PetroInternational is a company that I formed after I retired from ExxonMobil. Our job primarily is to do consulting, training, and contracting. Look at the project timeline. There are areas in a project early which we call development planning. In development planning, we provide consulting services and training for resource definition, defining objectives and strategies for conducting the project, work on initial design basis, screening cost and schedule, and then providing support for funding. And the next phase, which is defined as concept selection, optimization of the concept, as well as front-end engineering, we provide services on commercial structure, roadmap, cost and schedule, optimization, and front-end engineering design. And finally, in the last stages, execution and commissioning, we provide support on detailed design, procurement, construction, installation, and then system completions. My current interests right now, which are support of project engineering and management, has to do with the introduction of augmented reality, digital twins, and metaverse into project planning and execution. According to Paul Daugherty, which is an Accenture Group Executive Vice President, we're at the early stages of metaverse, and it's advancing very quickly. The companies who do not participate allow others to design things for themselves and not for us. And that's something that we have to participate sooner than later in order to make sure that we are a part of what we want to be in the metaverse. The application of augmented reality based on brownfield modification to offshore facilities. This is an area of great interest to me. And the reason is because over the years, we have been involved in modification, upgrade of platforms, and platforms present a very complex and dense environment, very expensive environment, which modifications require a significant number of visits and inspections and studies, all done separately through multiple travels to offshore sites, creating a lot of costs, and in the process of multiple engagements, multiple confusions are caused. So they fit themselves into metaverse and augmented reality very well. On the right-hand side, we're showing a schematic of a pump being installed in an area, and there's an inspector on site, but then there are other people, let's say somebody in Japan from a location that is involved in equipment manufacturing, somebody else who's in procurement, there could be engineering. All of these people can be on location simultaneously and have meetings through a metaverse and through the environment that are sharing information at the same time. So they can all be on board. The number of inspections can be reduced. The travel to site could be reduced significantly. And the end result is that the design is going to be a lot more accurate at a much quicker time and at a much lower cost. On the left-hand side, I'm showing a digital twin imposed on an existing facility. And this acquisition of digital twins are pretty straightforward. There are a number of companies right now who are exploring that and provide that service. And by imposing a plant development or a future design on an existing facility, we can reduce costs and schedule and be able to move on and get the project sanctioned and completed much quicker and better. Now, over the years, I was thinking about what is the key learning from my career. And as I thought about it more, I realized that the success, in my opinion, is a career roadmap that challenges you at each milestone. If there are no challenges, your excitement level is low, would be low, and you're not interested, or you won't be as interested in working and learning as it is if you are being challenged. My advice to those who are starting their careers is to empower yourself, create opportunities, and welcome challenges. With that, I'm happy to answer any questions, and I want to thank you for your time. I realize it's late, and hope that I still kept some of your attention.
Thank you so much. Very, very impressive experience. We have some questions. At the same time, I encourage the audience, if they are comfortable, they can unmute themselves and ask questions by themselves. I place it in your chat. You can read them, or if you want, I can read. You can answer.
Okay, just a second. All right. So there's a question from Hamid.
I placed it four questions. No, I placed it.
That's
the
not
first
a question
from the Dr. Fattahi asked two questions.
Go ahead, Doctor.
Maybe I
Okay.
can read for you.
Well, I'm looking at the first one I'm seeing is Mr. Bill Dyke. Did you work with Clark Hall, Regulatory Environmental, on this project?
Oh,
I'm sorry, which project? I talked about a lot of projects.
he left. He left.
Okay, he did. Well, I don't recognize Clark. And keep in mind, it's been close to 20 years or 15, 16 years. So at this point, I don't recall Clark. Dr. Fatahi is asking, would you recommend an overseas assignment for younger engineers at the beginning of their career or in the middle or perhaps in their late careers? That's an excellent question, Dr. Fatahi. At this point in time, I recommend any time an opportunity, particularly overseas, arises, that one should volunteer and move forward, because there's no guarantee that these opportunities would show themselves at a later time. During the time where I entered the industry, our industry was at a much higher level of operations, with oil prices high and numerous capital projects being executed around the world. And so I was fortunate to take advantage of these opportunities and accept these assignments. Today they're less, significantly less, but if something arises, by and large, it represents a significant amount of learning, and I think younger folks should take advantage of that and move forward without hesitation. Another question: how do you see the future of oil in the anticipated energy transition world? I honestly haven't thought much about this thing. There is a transition, clearly, but one has to keep in mind that oil has a huge presence in the world right now, and transition would take a long time. And in the transition, oil may end up becoming a petrochemical, a product of much more value than just the fuel for automobiles. So I can see that transition. Clearly, in aviation, it's going to continue to be a major aviation fuel, maybe with a blend from some of the other, other products, such as methanol or what have you, synthetic fuels. But still, when it comes to aviation, it would remain, in my opinion, a significant fuel for a foreseeable future. And then at some point in time, I'm sure that, we would be using it for other products similar to what we've done before, like, your plastics and textile and what have you. We have a question from Mr. Fuad Hairi. Following up on Dr. Fatahi's question, do you see EOR coming back to the picture ever again? EOR is a matter of economics. And as I mentioned, at the time that it really it expanded, the expansion was supported by US government through windfall profit taxes. So they gave an incentive to domestic oil producers to, instead of paying taxes to the government, to use that money for EOR development. And I believe that if the price of oil remains high, that we can easily justify EOR for some of the oil that we currently are not. But even today, some EOR is being conducted economically based on available EOR techniques that we're using. It's interesting that in a recent presentation by Dr. Irshadi, he was referring to use of some of the CO2, for example, as a means of sequestration of CO2, that we could inject that into the ground. And of course, that's one way utilizing CO2. The only concern is that once the oil is produced, then the CO2 is released again. So it's got to be recycled. But I guess I'm kind of mumbling. I think it all depends on the economics of oil and the support from government. Another question, would you recommend an overseas assignment for younger engineers? I think we addressed that question. Okay, the second question we followed, following it up there, okay. And then finally, you experience non-US and US oil companies in terms of company culture. What are the differences? You know, I can't really get into that at such short time. The culture of, there's a certain amount of discipline that exists in the US oil companies that remains to be seen in some of the areas that are visited, that are experienced. And that discipline has to do with, with established processes that U.S. oil companies have had a long history of practicing with. So in terms of culture, it's I believe the culture should be guided through practices and processes with proper discipline to make sure that the projects are conducted properly and the benefits are experienced by both nationals as well as visiting companies. What an amazing career. Okay, so what I was thinking. A question regarding, did you get to move to different countries with your family? Any tips managing that for families with kids? My family stayed in America. I was always on assignments as an expat individual, family unaccompanied. However, many of my colleagues, particularly in countries like Qatar or Nigeria, they had their families with them, and their life was very, very pleasant. The children typically attended appropriate schools and numerous activities for both families, spouses. Many of the spouses would benefit from engagements in community work and supports, and the relationships were quite well. A lot of the kids who studied overseas in the schools ended up graduating with high honors and attending good universities. So overall, I would say that companies, reputable companies, ensure that the life of families that are accompanying their spouses are managed and are very fulfilling. You have changed the question. You have changed companies in your career. What is your opinion on staying with one stable company for long term, or changing different roles? Considering pressure on oil industry, do you have recommendation to invest in other skills in other areas, including CCUS? I'm sorry, I don't understand CCUS.
Carbon capture and utilization.
Oh, I see. Okay, all right. Well, in terms of staying with one company versus not, it depends on the level of challenges that you have in the company that you're working with. If the company is offering you assignments and you're able to to intellectually be satisfied with the type of work you do, as well as find financial stability and support from your colleagues and peers, then I recommend that you stay in one company. One of the reasons I left is after 20 years with Unical, I had some family issue regarding my wife, and we returned home because of some health reasons. And I took a leave of absence, and after we recovered from that, I decided that I wanted a bigger, more, I wanted to expand my activities and responsibilities. And at that time, ExxonMobil approached me, and I was, and that was a welcome arrangement. So I moved on to Exxon. Otherwise, I would probably have stayed with Unical. But with respect to the carbon capture, I have some ideas of my own. However, they are. It's a very complicated technology. The reason is because of the current exposure, the levels of CO2 in the atmosphere, and then ability to collect. I think that our focus should remain on our sources that are generating CO2 at this point in time, and begin to capture those at high concentrations, and then divert those in any way we can, either through sequestration or through injection into subterranean formations, either for retainment. There are some technologies to capture CO2 from air, but at this point in time, they're very early, and I have some doubts about the economics. Those need further studies. There were additional studies and research that was done through use of algae to capture CO2, and those have some viability. However, they need further research, and this is not an area that I have spent a lot of my time on, but I do believe that with the progression of technology, we can transition into an area, into a world where we are able to reduce the amount of CO2. Do you think there will be another oil industry recession in the near future? Recessions in the oil industry historically have been caused by oil shocks, oil price shocks. When the oil price goes up, there's kind of a boom, and when the price starts coming down, we run into a bust. And if you follow the trend in the oil price, you can just see that every time we had the industry prospered from a high price, then it went into a recession that followed that. Going forward, with respect to U.S. alone, I think the effect is going to be experienced less. And the reason is because U.S. is switching more toward electricity and electricity generation, although it relies on natural gas. But natural gas reserves of U.S. are huge. They're tremendous. I've seen figures as high as 2,300 TCF of gas, which far exceed any other country's gas figures. With that, we can see a transition, accelerated transition toward the use of natural gas and electricity. The oil component of it, of course, as I mentioned earlier, will have to find use elsewhere. Some in the transportation fuel, and probably some into conversion to petrochemicals. But the recessions are a part of the economic structure particularly the developed world economic structure, and they're unavoidable. I don't see any more questions. I would, if anyone has any other questions right now, I'm happy to answer.
I think the time is past, and if you don't mind, I can close the session. Once again, I would love to thank you, Dr. Mohammadi. You had a very great talk and very important advice, and I hope we can be a good follower. And thank you so much for the other participant. I hope you have a very great time. Have a good time.
Thank you. Thank you and good evening.